Today we're in Jamestown, Virginia, at the location of the Jamestown Colony. Now, I just want to point out right up front, there are two establishments that are within a mile or two apart. One is Historic Jamestown, which is where we are here, and the other one is Jamestown Settlement, which is a reproduction of what the fort and the Jamestown Colony may have looked like, and it's more geared for school children, I believe, whereas this one is the actual site, and archaeologists have confirmed it, and that's where we are today. Now, on this video, I'm not going to be doing a lot of walking around. This one is going to be information given from one of the park's tour guides, and this guy is phenomenal. So check this one out if you're looking for any good information on Jamestown, and if you want to see everything walking around, I'll do a subsequent video after this one.
And this is one called the Palatine in English. This is going to be almost like your orientation film today, right now, because that orientation film is not running currently, although many ways I feel like it's a disorientation film. There's all these things you're getting thrown at. So hopefully I'll provide you some context, some big picture, like what's really going on here 400 years ago. I also like to call this tour Jamestown Chapter 1. If we think of Jamestown as a book about the 1600s in Virginia, then Chapter 1 is when the English first arrived, how the Palatine reacted to that arrival, John Smith, Pocahontas, Jamestown Fort, First Assembly. You think about it, 99% of what we learn about Jamestown in school, Chapter 1. So we'll focus on Chapter 1. Chapter 2, though, is when Jamestown makes enough money off tobacco that the fort expands into a town to your right. If you're here at 2 o'clock today, I'll be doing a tour called The First Africans, which will definitely be covering Chapter 2. We'll go that direction. So if you're still here, you can check that tour out. Chapter 3 is sort of when Jamestown wants to be respectable, right? That kind of wooden town that was kind of cheap and not very pretty looking was turned into a brick city by the 1660s. And that's kind of the Jamestown that has one thing still standing, which is the church tower in front of the replica church. So I'm going to be honest with you and tell you there's only one thing above ground not found by an archaeologist that's been standing since the 1600s, and it's the church tower representing Chapter 3. So I came out here on a field trip in 1990. I grew up near Richmond, and I had Jamestown totally drilled into my head. And I came here in 1990, and I was told that the original site of the Jamestown Fort had long ago washed away into the James River because of erosion. Some of you might remember that used to be our tour. It would last 10 minutes. We would look at some lovely monuments, but when you're in the 6th grade, after your 6th monument, you start going, that's a bit disappointing. I remember liking the tower, thinking that was interesting, but there was this sort of sense of loss that, you couldn't even stand on the ground where it happened. Now, this tour is an historical tour, but I work with the archaeology team. I'm sort of the historian on an archaeological project. And right now, the archaeology is going on Monday through Friday. We hope to return to 7 days a week by the summer. We're kind of slowly reopening everything. Point is, the archaeology team began working out here in 1994. They only supposed to be working for 10 years. 10 years. And we are now in the 28th year of a 10-year archaeological dig. And that means 3.5 million artifacts have been found. And that means we found out that the Jamestown Fort was not in the river, but the footprint of it, the shadows that remain, were uncovered by archaeologists. So we were able to rebuild the Jamestown Fort exactly where it was, exactly how it looked. And sometimes that disappoints people, because you're thinking, this fort looks a little ramshackle. Well, maybe it did, ladies and gentlemen. I want to kind of change your mind if you don't already know a lot about Jamestown, or maybe you do, because I change my mind all the time. I don't want you to think someone standing up here has all the answers. I don't have all the answers. But I'm learning new stuff myself every day I'm out here. And I've been here for 9 years, so I'm definitely telling you something different now than I would have told you 9 years ago. And who knows what I'll be saying in 9 months, because we're always going to discover something new that gives us more, new, better information. But my philosophy is this. I think there's not a whole lot of difference between the past and the present when you're talking about personalities. And we need to get past the idea that Jamestown is just guys in poofy pants and lace collars, and get past just the museums that always have the silver bowls and silver plates. Because most museums, quite frankly, are buying their artifacts. And when you go out to an auction and you buy your artifacts, you get that top-down look at the past. We've been digging up the garbage for 28 years. What we're finding out is a military base here. But we're also finding out about people who are not English, people from other parts of the world, including the people that were already here. All right, so let's get started by saying, what is the world like in 1607? We're going to do this in about 5 stops. I'm going to start with the Palatine, then why the English are here, and then we're going to see these two groups interacting. A lot of the time it's going to be conflict, but there will also be times as peace. But when we're talking about the Palatine and we're talking about the English, we have to keep in mind that the way the rulers thought might have been different than the way individuals on the ground thought. There are always going to be people who want to keep the peace. There are always people who can get along, particularly children. When we're talking about leaders and nations, they have interests. The English have interests, and the Palatine people are equally a nation with their own interests. You didn't see that on that monument, though. Now, the monument was put up in 1907. Nothing wrong with that. I mean, I kind of of the opinion that a monument, whether we agree with it or disagree with it, it's interesting to see why it was put up. And in 1907, you have to keep in mind, Virginia is taking a backseat to Massachusetts. You might be familiar with the Pilgrims in 1620. I'm not here to bash them. I'm here to say that after the American Civil War, that was the story that was pushed as the founding of modern America. But we can all do the math and know that Jamestown is 13 years older. So there wasn't a whole lot else to see here besides the church tower. So in 1907, when Virginia turned 300 years old, lots of statues were put up. This obelisk, that admission gate, the John Smith statue, most of the monuments you're going to see today are from 1907. So they reflect 1907. So in 1907, they say Jamestown's the first permanent colony of the English people. I agree with that. It's the birthplace of Virginia. In the modern sense, yeah, I agree with it. But we're saying, and of the entire United States. And all I got to say is, welcome to Virginia. But we like to be first in everything. You see, you can actually pick that apart, because we all learn in school by the 4th grade a phrase like this. The Jamestown represents the first permanent English settlement in the New World, North America, the United States. I can guarantee you somebody who wrote that was a lawyer. Very carefully worded. When you tell someone something is the first permanent English settlement, that automatically tells me there must be a first settlement that's English that's not permanent. In other words, anybody from North Carolina right now can say, yeah, Roanoke, you know, we're 20 years older than you guys. Yeah? By the way, they leave that out of the admission video. They're like, we don't want to admit that. But that's true. Roanoke is 20 years old. Now, we can say, well, those people disappeared. They were lost. They weren't permanent. Well, they've got archaeologists working there now that used to work here, and they're a year or two away, I think, from completely blowing that story open. And we're going to have to change our minds about that. But see, the thing is, if you consider Roanoke a failed colony from a business point of view or a political point of view, just know that there were like 9 other English colonies in America older than Jamestown, but they weren't successful. They weren't permanent, okay? That's what that means. Now, first permanent English settlement means there must be a first permanent settlement that's not English. And anybody from Florida's got this one. St. Augustine, we're 50 years older than you guys. People still live there. That's sort of kind of permanence. Very inconvenient to our video. It's left out. And we say that that doesn't matter because it's not English, because, you know, 20% of the U.S. population can say that's my ancestry. So always be careful when you write someone out. And if you're a Palatine right now, your hand should be up. We got you all beat here, right? So we know that Native American peoples estimate, this is estimation, maybe 14,000 years ago entered modern Virginia. Our oldest artifact ever found in this area that would have come from the river about 12,000 years ago. The people we call the Palatine, though, are a little more recent. They would have originated from farther south. We're going to talk about them. Well, I want to follow the story of a very important person who has 3 different names. This will be like the hardest part of the tour. Trust me, things will get a little less complicated as we go along. But let's set up the story to say that people are already here. They've been living here for thousands of years. But who are the Palatine people you hear so much about? So the Palatine people were not one tribe. That's kind of a common mistake. The Palatine people were actually 6 different Native American nations that grew to be 30 Native American nations. Think of it this way. The United States is one country. We have 50 states. We used to have 13 states. How did we go from 13 to 50? Through war? Texas, California says yeah. Through states wanting to join us that were new? Ohio and Nebraska says yes. From states that broke away from other states? West Virginia says yes. So the Palatine people were the same way. They grew more powerful through conquest, through trade, through business, through blood ties, like any great nation anywhere in the world. But the Palatine people were really growing because this old phrase, there's strength in numbers. The Palatine people were organizing and becoming more powerful in response to what they saw was a threat from Europe. And I'm not talking about the English. You see, before the English ever came here in 1607, the Spaniards would say, we were already here. According to the Spanish, it's not the Chesapeake Bay, it's the Bahia de Santa Maria. According to the Spanish, this isn't Virginia, this is Florida del Norte. And this area is called Ajacan with a J. Now, in the 1560s, I want to tell you, the Spanish came up the Chesapeake Bay. We know this from Spanish records. And the Spanish captain actually saw two Native American boys, who would be Palatine, come up to the Spanish. Often teenagers were sent to kind of check things out. But these two young men were taken prisoner, stuck on a Spanish ship, and the Spanish went back home. Now, they described two boys who were teenagers. One you hear very little about. They weren't impressed with him. He kind of falls out of the historical record. I want to focus on the second boy. They said he was a chief's son or someone high-ranking. They said he was very intelligent and he picked up Spanish very quickly. And they called him Paquiqueño. Paquiqueño. Now, Paquiqueño lived in Spain for several years. He met the King of Spain. He learned Spanish fluently. And, ladies and gentlemen, he embraced Catholicism. If you were a Spaniard, you're thinking to yourself, this guy, he's become one of us. He's done everything we would properly want. But if you're this young Native American boy called Paquiqueño, you really want to do one thing and one thing only, which is return where? Home. And you're going to do anything you can to convince the Spanish to send you back home. What better way than to embrace their language, embrace their culture, and embrace their faith and say, I'll be your translator. So by 1570, follow me on this, the Spanish decide they want to Catholicize, Christianize, and remember, there's like a space race between the Protestants and the Catholics to gather more soil. Both religions thought the world was coming to an end soon in the 1600s. And so the idea is the Spanish wanted to set up a series of missions, and they wanted one here in the land they called Ajacan, or Florida del Norte. And so a group of Jesuits decided to go to Virginia. Now, Jesuits have a reputation of going on missions that no one else wants to take, the dangerous missions. And they took their translator, Paquiqueño, with them. But now he has a new name, Don Luis, baptized and named for the Viceroy of Mexico. That's his godfather. So Don Luis, who has been to Spain, who's been to Cuba, who's been to Mexico, is a young Native American from here, and now he's rising in power and rank, and they're going to bring him here to start a mission, and he's going to help them convert everyone. And they get here, somewhere near what's now New Kent County, Virginia, up the Chickahominy River. And they start a mission. And as soon as the priests begin building the church, what does Don Luis do? He takes his Spanish clothes off and he goes back home. See ya. Thanks for the ride. Now that story, unfortunately, did not end peacefully for those priests. Led by a guy called Father Juan Segura. Juan Segura was a good man. Nice guy, actually. Decent person. They didn't bring a Spanish garrison with them, which was very unusual, because they had Don Luis, and he took off. And then the priests were killed, all 6 of them, led by Don Luis. Now, how do we know this? There was an altar boy named Alonso who was Spanish, and the Palatine did not kill him. They spared him as he was a youth. And he did the same thing Don Luis did. He became the best Palatine of all time. He convinced the Palatine he was on their side because he wanted to go back home. And in 1571, the Spanish, who weren't hearing the letters from the priests anymore, sent ships from St. Augustine, led by Pedro Menendez, the John Smith of Florida. He came up this area, found out where Alonso was, got the boy back, and the boy said, the Palatine betrayed us, Don Luis betrayed us. And the Spanish got revenge on the Palatine by doing what? By shooting up the shoreline. Many Palatine were killed. So why do I tell you that story? Because I think Don Luis will be the same man called Opechancanough, the brother of Palatine, who will be very important to our story. And if that's true, that means Chief Palatine's younger brother, who's going to be very important to our story, has been to Europe before. That means when I say that Paquiqueño, Don Luis, and Opechancanough are the same person, that Opechancanough, who has John Smith tied to a tree asking him questions, knows the answers to the questions he's asking. It makes the Palatine world far more global and sophisticated than we were giving them credit for. And the point is, after the Spanish went away with this place in flames, what did the native people of Virginia start doing? Realizing their strength in numbers, and the rise of the Palatine people from 6 to 30 tribes was in direct response to what happened in 1570. That's why I want to tell you this backstory. Because now when I start the story in 1607, see what happens when you just start in 1607, you miss all that? Because you know what you see in most movies and documentaries? The 3 ships are going to come from England, and they're these European people. And you've seen this in movie after movie. All the Native Americans act scared and frightened and run away because they're scared of these people. And some historian gets on TV and says, the such and such tribe thought the English were God. And that's just not flat out true. They would have known these people to be from Europe. They knew what guns did. They knew what cannons did. They knew what ships did. And they're watching these English people come up this river in 1607, and they're checking it out. Now, they could kill the English right away if they want to, but they know what happens when you do that. Other ships come and seek revenge. Perhaps it's better to adopt a wait-and-see policy, because there weren't just Spanish ships. There were French ships, English ships, and Dutch ships that were going up and down this river and up and down the Chesapeake Bay for 80 years before Jamestown started. They didn't think the English were gods. They had this attitude. Oh, it's you guys again. Because when the English came up the river from Virginia Beach to here, which is 37 miles, it took them 3 weeks to do that, various Palatine tribes either started to shoot at the English people or go down to the shoreline to trade with the English people. When you're shooting at someone, you're saying, go away, I know who you are. And when you're trading with someone, you say, I know who you are, let's do business. The Palatine people have their own foreign policy. And when the English come here, they don't really know that yet. Chief Palatine, Wahoo-Sonnecock, the father of Pocahontas, the brother of Don Luis, is the man who goes from 6 to 30 tribes. And quite frankly, you never go from 6 to 30 tribes by being nice. Nor do you get from 6 to 30 by being cruel. You have to have intelligence, trade, and a strong military, all of which the Palatine have at the beginning of 1607 when the English show up. A much different story than you read right there behind. And I think a better one, because it's the world we still live in. It's called foreign policy. We're going to discuss it today. Now, for my next stop, I wanted to take you to the river. I'm going to show you the fort, the cannon, and let's think about why the English people are coming here in 1607, because this is not a colony for religious freedom. That does not mean these people are secular. There's no such thing as a secular colony 400 years ago. These are Christian people, but they mostly belong to the same church as the king. That's not what they're escaping. I'm going to tell you right now that Jamestown was started as a business. And that business was called the Virginia Company of London. And I'm going to tell you, I think they're the SpaceX of 420 years. Could that possibly cause some problems? Yeah. Let's find out. Mission, if I have any mission today, is to say the past is more sophisticated than we give it credit for. People of all cultures are more sophisticated than we give them credit for. Sometimes that's lost in a lot of museums. I never believe there's such a thing as ye olden days. Because people are people. Yeah, our technology's changed, some of our values have changed, and hopefully for the better. I'm talking about personalities here. So the Palatine people have to react logically to something, just like the English people are acting logically to something. It doesn't mean we always agree with them. We're talking about how people thought, if we were in their shoes. So the Palatine people, remember, go from 6 to 30 tribes. They called the land here Sinnacomica. Essentially means the crowded place in Algonquin. That's everything from Washington, D.C., down to North Carolina to Virginia Beach. So if you drive north up Interstate 95 and look to the right, you're in Sinnacomica. They call it the crowded place, population 14,000 people. Wow. So one thing we have to say that is different from now and then is how many fewer people were alive anywhere in the world. But to say that is to say that the Palatine people are watching those English ships come here. Why are they here? Let's go back to England in 1606, a country that's not doing well. Okay, if you're England, you have a bit of a reputation problem. That your arch rival, Spain, has spent 120 years gobbling up, in your mind, most of the world. So is Portugal. France is getting involved. England can't get it right. I mean, think about this. When you think of the later British Empire, it's so powerful, the sun never sets on it. No, in 1606, that hasn't happened yet. England has tried and failed over 10 times to start an American colony, and they can't get it done. And they don't get it done under the reign of Elizabeth I, who I argue, along with Winston Churchill, one of the two greatest leaders in English history. She was interested in colonies. They named the land Virginia after her, land of the Virgin Queen. She never married, she never had children, but she dies in 1603. Her brothers and sisters are dead. She has no children. They need a new king or new queen of England, somebody who is a cousin of hers, who is of a church acceptable to the English people. Queen Elizabeth, who likes colonies, is dead. And they invite the King of Scotland, King James, to be the King of England. So James VI becomes James I, and he doesn't have to stop being the Scottish king. He now runs 2 countries at once. He also claims to be the King of Ireland, but if you're Irish, you're going to say, I don't agree. So how did King James get to be a big deal? Through who he was related to. Through military conquest. Through business, just like Chief Palatine. Powerful people think a certain way. Here's the thing about King James, though. One of the most frugal kings in English history. Perhaps one of the cheapest kings in English history. But when you want to start a colony, remember, it was as expensive back then as space travel is today. So the king thinks colonies are a waste of money, a waste of blood, a waste of treasure, a waste of time. And yet, if you want to go to Virginia, you need the king's permission. Now, you don't have to understand that anytime you get a new king, it's kind of like getting a new prime minister or a new president. I don't even care what side you voted on. We're all aware that when you have a change in administration, a lot of stuff tends to happen more at first. And I've been through how many presidencies at this point, and I've seen the same thing every 4 years. So it's the same thing with a new monarchy. I'm going to tell you, there's a bunch of people throwing a lot of pieces of paper at King James because they want to see, hey, what's this new guy going to do for us? And just like nowadays, we're nothing new. About half the English people like King James, the other half don't. It's all politics. And King James has someone shoving a piece of paper in his face, and they're called the Virginia Company of London. Now, who are these guys? Well, they represent the richest people in England. We're talking about bankers, merchants, landowners, lords, okay? They form a company, the Virginia Company of London. Let's consider that to be a corporation. Now, they want to invest their own money to send people here to Virginia. And the reason they're going to do that is, if the people they send over here find gold and silver, they make a whole lot of money for doing very little work. So that's all great, but they're not going to be allowed to do this without the king signing this piece of paper. So they have what's called a charter. And the first charter is a permission slip signed by the king. And I have read a lot of 17th century papers in cursive. And I will tell you something, this was definitely written by lawyers. Because it actually says where Virginia is, and it says that you can go to Virginia, and I'm translating loosely on purpose, but the point is, it essentially says that if you go over here and you get yourself killed, you can't blame the king. If you go over here and you start a war with the Spanish, you can't blame the king. If you want to pay for this, he's not paying for any of it. But if you find a bunch of gold and silver, he gets 20% of the money just by being the king. So it's good to be king. So King James is going to have this river named for him, this fort named for him, this town named for him, this county named for him, and a version of the Bible named for him. All things he actually disagreed with for the most part. It's very interesting because they want his patronage. So it's not the king we're talking about, it's the company. I call them SpaceX because it is a private company trying to make money by sending people over somewhere far away. When I heard Elon Musk 4 weeks ago was talking about making money off Mars, all I heard on the news was, man, this guy sounds like the Virginia Company. Okay, now that's important because I can understand the business move. I mean, this country is built on certain business principles that we still adhere to this day. But the point is, that's not the people coming here. Those are the people paying for Jamestown. Who's coming here? Well, those are the desperate people in England. Perhaps some of your ancestors kicked off their farms because they were renters, and the landlord thought sheep made more money than poor farmers. Homeless people, jobless people, like in many countries today, before one chooses to leave your country, you try to make it your own country first. So you go from the country to the city, and what happens to London? It gets overcrowded, violent, and desperate. So there's a lot of people who might see Virginia as an opportunity to better themselves. Let's never mock those people just because their leaders could be incompetent. I understand why people came here, but I also understand why the Palatines fought them. That's what we're trying to do today. What is the different perspectives? So 104 men and boys are here. It took them 3.5 months. Now they land in April of 1607 in Virginia Beach, Cape Henry to be exact. And then they want to come here. Why? Because they're under instructions to work for the company. And the company does not want them to die because then they don't make any money. And the company said, when you come up here, you got a checklist to follow. What is the checklist? Well, number one, hide from the Spanish, who consider this to be Florida del Norte. If you stay in Virginia Beach, you're sitting duck. That's why you're 37 miles to the west of the Atlantic Ocean. Let's go check number one on that. Number two, you need to find a river deep enough so your ships don't get stuck. Now, I can walk out in the river now and be up to my waist. But see the green buoy right there? We're talking 60 feet deep up there in the middle of the river channel. You still see ocean-going ships coming up here from time to time. So I'm going to say check number two, they did a good job. All right. Now, also, you want to think about what else you want to do here. You need to build a fort, but you need to build a fort on high ground. Now, if you're from Colorado, there's no high ground here. But in Tidewater, Virginia, this hill is pretty high ground. And it's a military principle, the same thing you see in castles in Europe or an army base today or Gettysburg battlefield. When you have the high ground, you're going to win the battle. That's where you want to build a fort. Number four, they are told to pick land where they don't see any naturals. Don't actually settle where you see any Native American people. Now that sounds pretty nice. So they look around, they see no Native American people living here. And they say, this is perfect. absolutely perfect. And you know the old phrase, if it looks too good to be true, it's too good to be true. Because you have to ask yourself this very basic question. If this place is perfect, then why are the Palatine not living on it? You see, they arrived at the time of year you're feeling right now. We got pretty good weather here. I mean, we got the gnats that are bothering you, but other than that, you know, people come out here in April and May and say, this place is beautiful, it's nice. You know that no one says that in August? They're going to find out the hard way how bad this place is. So let's go over a checklist of what's wrong with it. Well, the river here is brackish, salt and fresh. Now, a brackish river won't kill you because the Thames River in London is brackish. So you can build a city on a brackish river. But we know something now that we didn't know until 1994, which is University of Arkansas doing a tree ring study of very old trees in Virginia, getting core samples and looking at tree rings and determining that the worst drought in 770 years occurred right at the beginning of Jamestown. Now, if you don't have a lot of rain and snow, then the salt content's going to be off the charts higher then than it would be today. Same thing with the bacteria found in this river. Nothing's filtering it, or the fact that there's arsenic in the swamp that you cross to get to me. A lack of rain makes all of those things go from bad to deadly. Also keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, that the English people thought that they needed to avoid the Spanish. Well, the Spanish never bothered to attack in the first place. And the other thing I want you to keep in mind is they said no Palatines wanted this land. Well, let me point out a couple villages that used to be here. Across the river, Palatine people right there. Over here to my far left, that's Paspahegh. Those are 2 of the 30 Palatine tribes. They use this land for hunting, not for living. Any guess which 2 Palatine tribes dislike the English the most? Because this is their hunting ground. It may be a bad place to live, but it's an excellent place to hunt. As we still have the white-tailed deer and wild turkeys here. Usually you leave before you get here, but I'm saying they're out here. And this is a good place for wildlife, and everyone knew it 400 years ago. Now, I want you to know that that we know what happened in history by what things are named. This is once the Palatine River and it becomes the James River. If that's once Creocahannock and now it's called Surrey, if that was once Paspahegh and now it's still called Governor's Land, that tells us what's going to happen in this story. But we know the end of the story. I'm here to tell you the beginning and the middle. Now we're to the middle. The English people are coming here and they're starting to chop down trees. So I don't think the Palatine are necessarily going to attack immediately. They're going to see, well, how long are these people going to be here? There's no point killing them if they're just going to trade with you for 3 days and go home. But when they start chopping down trees to build these walls, that changes everything. Now, how do we even know this stuff? Because remember, I told you in 1994, we'd still be telling you that this fort's in the river due to erosion. Well, thankfully, archaeologists began digging behind you. They began digging into the ground and taking buckets of dirt and sifting them on screens. And the artifacts stay on the screen and the wheelbarrow catches the dirt. And you look for artifacts, and anything made by a person is an artifact, including a 1993 Mountain Dew can. But we want stuff from before 1607 that's English. And sometimes that takes you all day long to find, or all week long. And it took our archaeologists 4 minutes to find the first artifacts from the 1600s. And we weren't finding silver bowls and silver plates. I'll give you an example of a big artifact we found the first year. It's a white bottle with green glaze. This is not an expensive item 400 years ago. Okay, it's not something a rich person would have. But if you read the label in the museum, it sounds expensive because you're going to see something saying, well, it's a lovely example of a Surrey, Hampshire boilerware drinking vessel. I feel like every museum curator has a side hustle working for the Williams-Sonoma catalog, making everything sound fancy. What this means is borderware means border ceramic. Surrey and Hampshire, England, outside of London. This was something you sell to people who have very little money. It's a common person's drinking vessel. And by drinking vessel, they really mean beer bottle. Can you imagine something in 400 years called Golden Colorado glassware or Coca-Cola plasticware as they dig through our landfills? So this is good for me, no, not bad. Why would I say that's good? Because we're getting working class people stuff. And we get gun parts and armor parts and what, broken tobacco pipes? I mean, who's really out here? Some lord's kid? In some cases, but for the most part, soldiers. And what would soldiers be doing today on Friday night? Party. Young men away from home, life and death situation, stressful. What do you do to relieve the stress? Is it really all that different? Is that who we're really talking about? You see, this is just flip the average museum upside down. So now that we find the trash, we start finding soil stains. features. Features are when archaeologists say a person's changed the dirt. When you leave a footprint, that's a feature. But when you dig a trench right here to put this pole in the ground and you fill the hole back in, you leave a stain in the shape of the hole you dug, and that's called a post hole. This foot-wide trench. This is actually this wall in 1994 that I'm standing next to. And then the darker stains, they're the actual wood rotting away. You play grown-up connect the dots. So the English people said, we came here, we built a triangle-shaped fort with half moons for bulwarks. And everybody nowadays is like, people are lying to you all the time in history. I know you've heard this one. I grew up in the 90s. Yeah, I was told people lie all the time in history. Well, sometimes, and sometimes they don't. I actually think a 400-year-old piece of paper is no different than logging onto Twitter. Some people lie to you, some people have no idea what they're talking about, and some people tell you the truth. I don't care if you're typing today or you're writing with an inkwell 400 years ago. I don't think people are lying about building a triangle-shaped fort because it's a boring thing to lie about, and people don't lie about boring things. If you told me what you had for lunch yesterday or what color your shoes are, I'm not expecting a lie. Now, people will exaggerate when they get really political, and they exaggerate when they want to get out of trouble or someone else in trouble, and people do that now, and people did that then. But when you say you build a triangle-shaped fort, you are telling me you chose the easiest design, where you're motivated not to be killed, that fits this landscape. We should be finding a triangle-shaped fort. So in 1994, we found this wall. In 1995, we found that wall. In 2003, we found that wall, and we've got a triangle-shaped fort. And we rebuilt it exactly where it was, exactly how it looked. And now if you're thinking this fort looks pathetic, remember, it's not the walls that keep you safe, it's the cannons behind the wall. And this curved wall right here is called a bulwark. And you see a replica cannon right here in front of you, which would have been here 400 years ago with 4 others. And why is it pointing at the river? Because the English are smart. Because they're thinking the Spanish are coming. And that cannon can shoot 900 feet, and any ship turning that corner will be facing the wrong direction to fight back. Because of the way the river channel works. Your ship is turned sideways, and you can't fight back. That's a great place to defend yourself from the Spanish, who don't show up. That's the point. It's overestimating Spain and underestimating the Palatine. Now the Palatine attacked the English the first week before the walls are completed. And why would they do that? Because they know what happens as soon as these walls go up. The English become difficult. If you're going to hit them, you're going to hit them quick. Now the English are really prepared for an attack from the front door. They are ill prepared from an attack from the back door. And so 300 Palatine warriors attacked the English the first week. By the way, it's the Paspahegh Quiacahanek. Any guess why? This is their land. The English are attacked by 300 Palatine warriors who can fire bow and arrow 4 times a minute versus 1.5 minutes for 1 musket shot. So ladies and gentlemen, the English nearly got wiped out the first week by underestimating the Palatine people's power. The only reason they didn't get wiped out, other than 1 boy getting killed, was that the ships were still here to fire the cannons. So the English learned a lesson that day. They learned to prepare for the Palatine, and the Palatine learned a lesson that day. Be careful of English cannons. The story did not start out nicely, did it? Now let's talk about leadership. Bad, then good, and see when it actually happens that the two cultures begin to interact through trade. Because it takes a year of failure before trade takes over from war. Let's go into the army barracks and find out about bad leaders and good leaders. Because there's a whole lot of bad leaders. United disease. We know that they had E. coli bacteria and salmonella poisoning themselves in the well water, in the river water. We know there's salt poisoning. We know there's malnutrition. And we can actually go over into that graveyard, and those are the people who died in 1607. Always go there if you want to remind yourself you're in the real place, not a recreation. Those graves are there. Those skeletons are there. I've looked at them personally. You see a boy of 14 killed with an arrowhead. You'll find people who died of disease and starvation. And you know, we always have these people arguing on the staff. What killed the Jamestown people the most? Was it the water? Was it the Palatine? Was it disease? I say it was bad leadership that got people killed. Out of 104 men and boys, after the first year, 38 are alive. Wow. Now that's bad leadership. And it's not that the people who are bad leaders are bad people. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying you have people in London who are businessmen making decisions that are life and death for people over here. You want to know why the United States eventually becomes its own country? Because that doesn't really work forever. You can't govern people across the ocean. If you don't believe me, ask Ben Franklin. He wrote a great essay about that. Because people making decisions there don't always know what they're doing. And they pick leaders sometimes here who are loyal to the company without being all that talented. So the first leader actually was the one who failed to build a fort in time. and he eventually got overthrown. The second leader was working men to death, building a palace in the woods while the soldiers lived in the mud. And the third leader quit because he was a nice guy. You can actually be too nice for this job. That's year one. No gold, no silver, underestimating the Palatine. All of this is a disaster. So my point is simply this. How are the English going to survive? Well, they need a good leader, and a good leader fast. He got a statue. He must have done something right. Now, of course, talking about Captain John Smith. Now, sometimes to people, John Smith is a cliche. I had a couple of teachers that used to roll their eyes when you talked about John Smith. I can remember a lot of people think of John Smith as a cartoon character. I want to rescue him from cliche right now. Captain John Smith was kind of obnoxious. I mean, I say that as a fan of his. What I am saying, if you ever read John Smith's books, he is absolutely the hero of every book he wrote about himself. No joke. So it's easy to dislike this guy. You may have served under John Smith and wanted to punch him in the nose. I get that too, because he was a my way or the highway kind of guy. But let me say this in his defense. Of all the English leaders, he grew up poor. He grew up a yeoman farmer's son in Willoughby, Lincolnshire. In other words, we're talking about a good old boy, ladies and gentlemen. A farmer's son from a country part of England. Lincolnshire is the most country part of England. If you're in Lincolnshire, it's Mississippi. If you're in London, it's New York. I mean that politically, I mean that culturally, it's the same difference. England's like America in that sense. So John Smith is indeed a good old boy. You can almost guess who's going to like him and who's not going to like him. Now, this is a guy who went from good old boy to captain, but he didn't earn his captaincy fighting for the English. He earned his captaincy fighting in Romania, and he got a coat of arms, not because of who his daddy was. He got a coat of arms by killing 3 Turkish commanders back to back to back in a duel. And he put their heads as his family symbol. A little gruesome, but it tells me who this dude is. Now, he might be perfect for this job, but he's going to make certain people angry. Now, 2 things I like about him. One, he grew up poor, and he took care of his soldiers. You're standing in an example of that. Remember, the men were living in the mud in foxholes, basically. Smith said he built barracks for the soldiers. By playing connect the dots, we can find the 4 walls of this building. We actually know it's a rectangle-shaped building. We know where the doors would be, where the fireplace would be. Room number 1, room number 2. It's a 2-story structure, therefore room number 3, room number 4. It had mud walls and a straw roof. We actually call it mud and stud architecture. It is essentially their version of a camper or trailer affordable housing. You can build it without being an architect. Kind of what a good old boy would do. Ladies and gentlemen, 99 buildings like this still stand in England, and about 96 are found in a place called Lincolnshire, England, where John Smith came from. But let's think about the political move here. Let's say you're cynical about this. Why would John Smith build this house for the soldiers? Because when you get them out of the mud, who are they going to be loyal to? You just gave them dignity. And people will serve under someone who gives them dignity. But they won't serve under someone who's getting their friends killed building him a palace. So Smith, check 1, is a good leader. Check number 2. Smith is not the friend of the Palatine. That's a myth. But Smith is smart enough to recognize the Palatine hold the cards, meaning they hold the food. Because I'm going to tell you that the corn cobs right now are more valuable than gold in a starving situation in 1608. Now, you might remember a story where John Smith got captured by the Palatine, but if you don't, in December 1607, when John Smith's watching other leaders fail, he says, I'm going to take off, take 2 men with me, and go up the river and see if I can find some food. So he goes 8 miles upriver, takes a right turn on the Chickahominy River, and he starts sailing up the Chickahominy River with 2 other English guys. Now, he doesn't realize he's sailing up some of the most sacred, important sites of the Palatine people, not too far from where the Spanish priests were killed 30 years ago. Now, John Smith decides, because this is John Smith, I'm going to get out of the boat and tell the other 2 guys to stay in the boat. Now, in any movie, what happens to the 2 guys that stay in the boat? In every movie. Yeah. So Smith goes exploring in the woods, right? And he's making a lot of noise, and he's clanging around. You know, they're watching him. Then all of a sudden, Smith notices he's surrounded by Palatine warriors, and he tries to shoot his way out. But as he backs up with his gun, he gets stuck in the mud, he says. I believe him. If you go out in the woods out here in the wintertime, yeah, in Tidewater, Virginia, you can get stuck in the mud very quick. So Smith gets dragged out of the mud, and the Palatine warriors, they shove him down to the river, and they point at the boat. Now, there's a universal language when you see 2 dead guys in the boat, which is, if you don't cooperate, what's going to happen to you? Some people ask me, why didn't they just kill John Smith? Because he's wearing armor, he's an English chief. And if you're trying to capture someone for intelligence, you capture the captain, not the private. It's Smith's armor that saves him, not because it stops the arrows, but because he's high-ranking enough to be important. And that's why John Smith is tied to a tree, being asked questions of the war chief of the Palatine, the second in command Palatine person in the entire world. Of course, that's Opechancanough, who used to be Don Luis, who used to be Paquiqueño. And John Smith actually says that he tricked Opechancanough. Oh, I pulled out my compass, I told him about the world, I showed him all these new technologies, and he was amazed at what I saw. But if he's the same guy I told you about earlier, he already knew the answers to all those questions, and he already knew what all those gadgets did. That's fascinating to me. He just wants to know why the Englishman is here. Now, I've actually mapped this out, but Smith said he was taken to all these different villages, and when you actually map it out on a modern map of Virginia, Smith in 2 months is just going on a map, zigzag, 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 because I think the Palatines are trying to disorient him from knowing where he is. Long story short, by the end of that ordeal, John Smith actually meets Chief Palatine. He has a conversation with him. He sees all these religious ceremonies, and Smith is saying, I don't understand what's going on, but I really am impressing them. And then all of a sudden, they drag him out, and they put his head on a rock, and they're going to bash it open with a stick, and he's almost certain they're going to kill him. And you may know the next part of the story. Pocahontas, the 10-year-old girl, leaps on top of him. Daddy, Daddy, don't kill the Englishman. Now, did Pocahontas exist? Yes. Is Pocahontas hugely important to my story? Oh, yeah. But John Smith never added that Pocahontas saved his life until 15 years later. And several times in John Smith's writings, women save him at the last second because they fall in love with him. He is trying to sell books. But oftentimes, when your ego is at stake, you are going to, in many cases, try to explain away your mistakes. And I also would argue that if you talk to Palatine people today, they're saying, we didn't try to kill Smith because if we wanted to kill Smith, why would we have fed him for 60 days? But if you try to pretend to kill John Smith, and if Pocahontas sort of fake saves him, and it's all an elaborate ritual, well, that means Chief Palatine is saying the following: we're going to make you an offer you can't refuse. Because as soon as John Smith gets sent back to Jamestown and he becomes the 4th leader of Jamestown, what starts to happen to the starving English people? The Palatine begin bringing baskets of corn. Now, when I was a kid, I was told the Palatines begin feeding the English because the Palatines are nice people. Hear this very carefully. Of course, there are nice Palatine people, but if you're Chief Palatine, you are not going to feed the English people for free, or you stop being chief very quickly. Because the evidence is, indeed, there are corn cobs here, there are deer bones here, and there are definitely acorns here, and the Palatine are indeed feeding the English. But I'm going to say this yet again, but not for free. Because what else do we find? Sheets of copper, blue glass beads, English metal tools, all things Palatine people find valuable. English and Palatine begin trading with each other, because that's called respect, ladies and gentlemen. The Palatine people are feeding the English, and the English are paying tribute, paying taxes, one could say paying the rent. And Chief Palatine is keeping the English alive, not out of the kindness of his heart, but what's in it for me? Perhaps it's not about copper or blue beads. Perhaps it's about those guns and cannons. So Chief Palatine might be planning to kill John Smith later. And John Smith, who might be the friend of the Palatine at first, might be planning to actually fight the Palatine later. But for right now, they're going to be each other's best friend because they're playing politics. That's what people do who are leaders. So Palatine is smart and Smith is smart, and maybe they're playing a very dangerous game of which one can outsmart the other. But at least it works in 1608. Now, do I mean that all Palatine people and English people didn't like each other? Of course not, because we know there were children who were translators to learn each other's languages. There were Palatine people who lived with the English, and English boys who lived with the Palatine. And I really feel for those kids because they probably do feel conflict and dual loyalties. And they probably are trying to get along. But I'm talking about chiefs here, whether they're English chiefs or Palatine chiefs. They have interests. All right, 2 more stops. If John Smith's such a good leader, Mark, why did he get kicked out of Jamestown after 1.5 years? I want to take you to where John Smith had a real charm offensive in the middle of the fort. Because he's got a bunch of English guys not working very hard. So what did he do to make them work hard? And how did that make him really unpopular? It's actually kind of funny. We'll find out. All right, so remember, John Smith's the Army sergeant who's done 3 or 4 tours and hates the Pentagon. That's who he was. He's the kind of person the common soldier admires, but he's a trouble in the officers' club. The problem with Jamestown is there's too many officers. I mean, 50% of the colony is full of gentlemen. Now, these gentlemen were cash poor because they were younger sons, but they have inherited an attitude. So we took a little trip at Jamestown, And I'm oversimplifying just on purpose, but the 4 barracks behind you, if you can picture, and that's where the soldiers live. And they're working in the bulwarks, doing guard duty. There's actually a quarter guard where you're standing, where they got their weapons, okay? That's what they're doing. That whole street here where we have the modern blacksmith shop, they were blacksmiths, bakers, tradespeople. They're working pretty hard too. But over here behind me, that's where the gentlemen live. They're the finer sort. We had a conversation with them, smoking a pipe and drinking an ale, and you ask them, what are you doing for a living? They say, I'm in management, right? Problem is, there's a storehouse right here. You're standing on top of, picture a barn here. We don't always have the money to rebuild every building, but just bear with me. There's a barn right here in front of us. This is the infamous storehouse where the food is kept. Now food, as I say, more valuable than gold right now. And gentlemen, when they get hungry, they just get whatever food they want. But the laborers, they have to prove how much work they did, and they might getting a scoop of food like a cafeteria. Now again, oversimplification, but I want you to understand that the English class system is a real thing, and it still is a real thing, but it was way worse 400 years ago. And John Smith might be a captain, but he's on the wrong side of the class system according to these guys behind me. Now if you're John Smith, that's a big problem. It's very hard to get food, and there's always potential for war at the Palatine, and the company seems rather incompetent, and now you got a bunch of people saying, well, I'm a son of some lord, I don't have to do anything. Well, technically in England, they don't have to do anything. But John Smith does not roll like that. So he says when he takes command, he's complaining about what he called the idlers, the lazy people. And he took his key, he locked the door of the storehouse right in front of everyone, and said some interesting words. He that will not work shall not eat. If you don't work, you don't eat. Or we might say today, I don't care who your daddy is, son, pick up a shovel. I mean, that's the kind of dude we're talking about. But the thing about he that will not shall not eat is it tells me a couple of things. Number one, there might be some people kind of slow clapping right now. Smiles on their faces. There are going to be some guys behind me who absolutely know that Smith has just crossed the final line. But it wasn't just because John Smith violated the English class system. You might be familiar with the quote, he that will not work shall not eat, is 2 Thessalonians 3:10, and John Smith is not a minister. And according to the Church of England, that was a gigantic no-no. What kind of people in England read the Bible themselves without being priests and interpreting without being priests? Oh, we call them Puritans, ladies and gentlemen. But this time, one of them didn't go to Massachusetts. John Smith, school teacher at the age of 7, was the father of Anne Hutchinson of Salem, Massachusetts. That means John Smith was taught by a radical. And what John Smith did doesn't seem radical today, but is extraordinarily radical 400 years ago. And it could get him killed. And interestingly enough, a few months later, Smith indeed was asleep on a boat, wearing a bag of gunpowder, and we know that a stray spark landed on that gunpowder bag. If I want to be very careful, I will call it an accident, because that's what they called it, an accident. But I find it very suspicious, the timing of the accident. I find it very suspicious, the nature of the accident. And I find it very suspicious that the next leader of the fort is John Smith's biggest enemy, George Percy, the son of an earl, whose own father and cousin are in jail for, get this, the gunpowder plot against King James. Now, when Percy takes command, he represents the aristocratic party. He's not by himself. He has a lot of support behind him. But the problem with Percy is that he's very sickly, and other people who are powers behind the throne kind of take command. And some of these captains, they start saying, you know what, trading with the Palatine is weak. England is strong. We're going to take the food, not trade for the food. And in the military, when you're outnumbered 20,000 to 200, that is a fatal mistake. What happens to that deal between the Palatine and the English? It's gone. And if you're the Palatine, how do you retaliate? Well, if you try to take this fort, you're going to lose. You try to take these cannons on and these soldiers in armor, you're going to lose. You don't have to take the fort out. You just got to surround the fort. And in 1609 and 1610, the Palatine warriors have this place cut off. That's what we call the starving time, where 90% of the people die. And too many people say, oh, the weather was bad. That's not the weather. It's the leadership. It's a military defeat. It's a crushing defeat. And what happens to the people who are caught in the middle? Because not everybody here is a soldier. Not everybody here is a leader. You're talking about civilians here. We got men, women, and children here by 1690, 1610. Well, they tell us they had to eat cats and snakes and rats and dogs and horses and mice and shoe leather, all of which we found in that old well in 2009 and then that kitchen under the tarp in 2014. It is gruesome what we found. It gets even worse than that. We have youngsters present, but when I say They ate those who'd already died. I mean, they did. But I don't want to get too into detail. You can talk to me later. The point is, it's nasty, it's sad, it's tragic, it's awful, and it happened, and it's another example of failed leadership. All right, one more stop. How did the English rebound from this devastation? Well, in 1610, in the spring, they get rescued. And I'm going to take you to Jamestown's first church to talk about two important events. Where a war was started and where a war was ended. And it was ended and began on the exact same spot with a speech. The war began and ended with the same spot. Let's find out and we'll be finished. All right, this is Jamestown's most important building for several reasons. We knew that they had a church before they moved their churches behind me. They had a church they described as nearly 80 by 24 feet. From 2010 to 11, archaeologists began to find these poles in the ground that were in a rectangular shaped pattern. Each pole was nearly 8 to 10 feet deep. What that means is that the walls and roof are heavy and very tall structure. They said their church was 80 by 24 feet. We measured this to be 64 by 24 feet. We know the main door into the church is actually where we put the gap in the fence right now. If you were to remove the statue, what would have been where the statue is now was the main gate into Jamestown. So I think it's interesting that not only is this church oriented towards Jerusalem, which is proper, the doors matching the entrance to the fort, and it's the tallest building you would see. So all of this says this is by far the most important building in their culture. For their faith, but also for their politics, and also for their culture. All of these things are one and the same, though, 400 years ago. There is no difference between the church and the state. One is literally in the case of England when the king is the head of your church. Now, we do know that they had an altar back here. There's a railing right here where people kneel to take communion. The minister would stand up there. This is basically an Anglican church. Some Protestant, some Catholic features mixed together. Now, but it's also an important place for meetings. So the starving time people, we are told only 60 people survived the starving time, and they were described as walking skeletons waiting to die. They got two different groups that rescued them. One who missed the starving time by crash landing in Bermuda. That's where John Rolfe was, and they had 2 ships leave Bermuda that come here. But then in June, there's a huge fleet of 9 ships. This probably lifts the siege. The Palatine warriors leave because of the ships and the cannons. Now through that door, in 1610 in June, with 900 new people they're going to resupply and rescue, was a guy called Lord Delaware Thomas West. Now, he's one of the 50 most powerful people in all of England. He's your new governor. Stood about right here. Saw the walking skeleton. Declared martial law. We're going to have some discipline here is what he's going to say. But he also basically said the English people had embarrassed themselves. You had let us look weak. You lost the war, essentially. Now he's got 200 new soldiers right out here, right? And he says an interesting phrase right on this spot. He says the phrase, Irish tactics. That's why I mentioned the Irish earlier. We got 900 years of conflict between the English and the Irish. The Irish people had fought back against the English. And in fact, this fort was designed on one base in Northern Ireland, where many of the English captains and soldiers had served. And when the Irish rose up against the English, there was a way you did something back to them. We would today call it counterinsurgency. They might say Irish tactics. If the Irish and Palatine never met each other, they'd have a lot in common, because they had the same names given to them too. You will hear the same insult words if you read the history. Now, what that means to the soldiers is, we're going to hit the closest villages, actually within 20 miles of the fort, which means Kicquetan, where Hampton is behind me, Queyacahannock, and Paspahegh. Paspahegh was actually completely wiped out. That's not me trying to be correct. It's actually George Percy saying it's what happened. He actually said his soldiers got out of control. He couldn't stop it. What I'm trying to say is when that got renamed Governor's Land, that wasn't a cute name change. That's a political statement. It got named right after Paspahegh was taken out to make an example of Paspahegh. So Chief Pound realized, you want to keep this going? We'll take down every other one of your tribes, right? Except that message completely backfired. Because just like the Irish, what do the Palatines do? They're going to hit back. Oh, you hit me? I'll hit you. And what ends up happening, to fast forward a bit, for 5 years, is what's called the First Anglopolitan War. It was all over the map here. Hit and run tactics from the English. Come in with your ships, get off the ships, fire quickly, leave, take the corn. Palatine people, wait for the English soldiers to be in the woods, ambush them. Does it sound familiar to the 1960s and 70s in Southeast Asia? It's a similar idea, which is the English have the firepower advantage, the Palatines have the advantage of knowing the terrain. Both sides have so many advantages and disadvantages that after 5 years, it essentially leads to a stalemate, and these kind of wars are bad for business, right? So the English and Palatines probably both want to stop the war, but you can't stop the war and lose space and therefore lose your prestige. So someone's got to find a solution to end a war that seems unwinnable for either side. So an English guy named Samuel Argyle, a captain, privateer, pirate, we could call him a gangster if you want, just got back from killing some French priests in Maine, gets intelligence that Pocahontas, who's now 17, is living with the Palatine people. He parks his ship called the Treasure, guns facing out. Makes a deal with the Palatine tribe. Give us Pocahontas and we'll give you copper. But what's the implied threat? Ship's got the cannons facing your village. Pocahontas is now captured by the English. Now what they're doing here is actually a smart move from a political point of view. We got Pocahontas, Chief Palatine's favorite daughter, right? So you want your daughter back, here's what you're going to give us. All of our prisoners, all of our guns, and all of our tools for your one daughter. Now, Chief Palatine loves his daughter, but if he makes that deal, how does he look? So he can't make the deal. The English did not count on the Palatine not trading for Pocahontas. Pocahontas actually says, my father values me less than broken guns, until she was upset. But the thing about it is this. Maybe that was the point. If Chief Palatine lets his daughter stay with the English longer, then she learns their language, right? She learns their culture. She adopts Christianity with her baptism and the new name Rebecca. But remember, a man falls in love with her. A guy who showed up from Bermuda. The guy who's planting the tobacco that's going to make Virginia a fortune in chapter 2, our 2 o'clock story. His name is John Rolfe. And during a war, he says he falls in love with Pocahontas. He asked permission of Chief Palatine and his own governor, can they get married? Ladies and gentlemen, there's the solution to save face in both cultures. If Pocahontas marries John Rolfe, both sides can feel like they can step away from the conflict. So on April 5th, 1614, we're told that John Rolfe married Pocahontas at the church at the Capitol, meaning right through that door, up this aisle, stood Pocahontas, right in front of me, with John Rolfe and Richard Buck. Now, instead of starving people, there are Palatine people and English people with hopeful looks on their faces, hoping that the violence would finally end. And ladies and gentlemen, for 7 years, the violence ended and there was peace between the two cultures. Now, this is absolutely the perfect time to end the story and get a lot of applause. So, I got one more minute. I gotta say this ain't Disney. Unfortunately, Pocahontas dies in England. Chief Palatine dies the following year, 1618, and so does John Rolfe by 1622. When they die, what happens to the peace? And therefore, when you think about the tobacco growing, now that's good for the English because it grows the population, it leads to economic change, even the first representative government. There are positive things that happen at Jamestown. Never get me wrong here. But if you're a Palatine, you're watching the growth of the English with alarm. And when Chief Palatine dies, do you know who gets to be the new chief of the Palatine? His name is Opechancanough / Don Luis / Pacaquieno. And he visited Jamestown. He encouraged the Palatines to become Christian. He became the biggest friend the English ever had. You heard this one before? I will sooner have the sky fall than I will stop being your friend. On March 22nd, 1622, the sky will fall. The Palatine attacked the English by surprise. It was well planned, it was well rehearsed, it was well orchestrated, and Opechancanough only picked the closest tribes that he could trust. It nearly wiped the English out on a single day. Had a Palatine Christian not told Richard Pace it was coming to warn Jamestown ahead of time. The Palatine people see this as an uprising. The English people called it a massacre. You have to keep in mind the perspective of both groups. From an English point of view, this is a surprise attack and a betrayal. From a Palatine point of view, it's trying to get the drop on the English when there's the last chance to do so. When I was a kid, I was told Opechancanough was a bad guy. As an adult of Scottish heritage, I say he might be William Wallace. It all depends on your perspective. I'm here to tell you, though, that's a tragic anniversary. It's going to happen next year when it's 400 years since that attack. And believe me when I say different people have very polarizing opinions on that. My answer to all of them is simply this. At Jamestown, we have to talk about what happened, good and bad, and we have to recognize different perspectives and different legacies, and I treat this place the same way I treat Antietam Battlefield. We may have differences of opinion on who was right and wrong, but I always believe in respecting the dead no matter who they were. Would we have done better? Would we have done worse? But we have to talk about not what we wish would have happened, but what did happen. I would love to have ended the tour where Pocahontas married John Rolfe, but that wouldn't be true. The real reality of the story is that conflict actually was more common than cooperation. Perhaps if the children had been listened to, it wouldn't have been that way. But the reality is, we're talking about governments, not just how average people felt, who could always get along. So, I mean, the lesson of Jamestown today is a modern lesson, a lesson that's all over the world, not just America, not just Palatine and English. I'm saying it's the same lesson you see all over the world. When there is conflict, there's usually a fight over resources and limited resources. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, people can always get along as individuals. But governments have interests. Governments have interests. Okay, hope I still get applause. But thank you so much. Good to have you all here. Appreciate it.
All right, this has been the first of several Jamestown videos I plan to do. And that was a great tour guide today. I didn't catch his name. I wished I had. So if you happen to know the name of this gentleman, please include it in the comments so I can add that to the description of the video. All right, until next time.